My name is Duncan Wood. I'm President and CEO of the Pacific Council, and I'm delighted to have with us today two esteemed experts on the issue of migration and the role that Central America plays in that. First of all, let me introduce Andrew Selee, who is the president of the Migration Policy Institute, MPI, a global nonpartisan institution that seeks to improve immigration and integration policies through fact-based research, opportunities for learning and dialogue, and the development of new ideas to address complex policy questions, a position he assumed in 2017. He also chairs MPI Europe's Administrative Council. Dr. Selee's research has focused on migration globally with a special emphasis on immigration policies in the United States, Latin America, and the Caribbean. He is the author of several books, published many articles in journals. Prior to joining MPI, he was actually my colleague when we were both at the Wilson Center, my predecessor at the Mexico Institute when and actually brought me into the Wilson Center to run the Mexico Institute, and a longtime friend, personal friend, one of the most renowned authorities on migration. We're delighted to have you with us, Andrew. Thank you for joining.
Thank you, Duncan. Great to be with you.
We're also absolutely delighted to have René Celaya with us, who works with the International Organization for Migration, the IOM, in Costa Rica. He has been a transformational leader in international humanitarian development strategy and practice, furthering innovative approaches and partnerships through impactful outcomes. He grew up in Mexico and the United States, which has shaped his lifelong commitment to social equity and justice. Most recently, René served for 6 years as Vice President for Humanitarian Programs at Sesame Workshop and as the Managing Director of the Alan Simsim Initiative, an innovative collaboration between Sesame Workshop and the International Rescue Committee that provided impactful early childhood development opportunities and support to families affected by conflict, crisis, and displacement across the Middle East and North Africa. René brings with him a lifelong commitment to the issues of two humanitarian issues, and we're delighted to have him with us. René, thanks for joining.
Thank you for inviting me.
Wonderful. Now, to our audience out there, please, first of all, thank you for joining. And our speakers are going to be engaging in a moderated conversation for about 30 to 35 minutes here. And please, send in your questions. We want to include you for as much as possible during this conversation. So, think of the questions that you'd like to ask, and we'd be delighted to pass those on to the participants. This, of course, is an election season in the United States. We are now just over a week away from the U.S. election, and election season in the United States has once again focused quite heavily on migration. It's been a major topic of differentiation between the two leading candidates in the presidential election. It has featured at the level of congressional races across the country, and of course is present at the level of state races as well. Having said that, although migration is very often a feature in U.S. elections, the migration debate has shifted dramatically in the United States over the past 20 years. Just one example, it used to be all about Mexico and Mexican migration, and it's still about Mexico, but in a very different way. It's much more now about Mexico's role as a partner for the United States in stemming migration, and even more, it's about the place that Central America plays or holds in migration flows. Migration from Central America to the United States is driven by a combination of economic hardship, violence, political instability, and climate-related issues. High poverty rates and limited economic opportunities, compounded by gang violence and political corruption, have made daily life precarious in countries across the region. Additionally, climate events such as droughts and hurricanes have disrupted agriculture, exacerbating poverty and hunger in many parts of the region. Many migrants from Central America see the United States as a place of safety and economic opportunity, even though the journey is dangerous and U.S. immigration policies are complex and often restrictive. But Central America matters not just because it is a source of migration, but also because of the transmigration that takes place through it. And that's one of the issues that we really want to explore in this seminar today. The role of Central America, can it partner effectively with the United States, with international organizations, and with civil society to help stem migration and to provide the right kind of care for migrants as they pass through Central American territory. The changing makeup of migrants being detained at the southwest border of the United States highlights the increasingly global and complex nature of migration into the United States. And that's one of the things that we hope to do here at the Pacific Council, is to really add the nuances and the deeper understanding of these conversations, rather than just relying on the cliches of election season here in the United States. So without any further ado, let me kick this off by turning to Andrew Selee. Andrew, I wonder if you could comment a little bit on how migration patterns have changed over the past 20 years here into the United States. It's a radically different conversation that we have over migration than 20 years ago. As I mentioned in my introductory comments, it used to be all about Mexico and migrations. It's now quite different. Could you comment on that and also on Central America's role in the new migration?
Sure, Duncan. First of all, it's great to be with you. It's great to see you as an old friend and colleague, but also be at the Pacific Council, where I have been a member for many years, actually, and participated in a number of task forces. So great, always great to be with folks from the Pacific Council. This is a radically different time, right? Until about 2012, when we talked about migration, we were talking about Mexicans, mostly Mexicans. There were always 1 or 2% of the people who came across the border were from somewhere else and had come through Mexico. But we were overwhelmingly talking about Mexicans, mostly men, not exclusively, but certainly adults. And they were largely headed to the United States to work. And some of them may have been fleeing from something, but I can tell you, I worked on the border with migrants in the 1990s, and generally they would not say that as a reason, right? They were coming to the United States to work, even if they might be fleeing from something. You started to see, starting in 2012 and then much more so in 2014, Central Americans coming. And then really the numbers really went up in 2018. Countries, primarily Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. And those numbers, went up considerably. And then you started to see since 2021 rather, you started to see large numbers of people coming from all around the world. And particularly large numbers of Venezuelans have come in the past few years. The numbers have dropped now, but we were seeing very large numbers of Venezuelans, not surprising since they were, a population that had been displaced from Venezuela and were living in other countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. Large numbers of Haitians, many of whom had been displaced from Haiti, but had moved to another country first and were coming up. And then people from other countries in South America, as well as lots of people from China, South Asia, and many countries in Africa. And so a few things have changed. I think it's worth saying one thing that changed is that now you can get through the Darien Gap, which is a dangerous place between Colombia and Panama, that used to be more or less impenetrable. There were always a few people that braved their way through it, but now there are well-established smuggling routes. There are also smugglers who figured out routes through other places, through Nicaragua, El Salvador, other countries along the way. Thanks to this technology, people can find out about places they couldn't have imagined at another moment. And they can find smugglers. They can figure out where you need a visa and where you don't need a visa, right? People have some agency on this. And increasingly, and I'm sure we'll talk about this as we get into this, asylum has also become, and so these are, increasingly when we saw Central Americans, these are be Central Americans, often with families coming across, often seeking asylum, often talking about needs for protection. Asylum systems everywhere in the world have also become both a safeguard for people who need protection, but also sometimes a draw for people who wouldn't otherwise, because it is a way when you get to a border. This is true in the United States, but it's also true in Canada. It's also true in Europe, true in many places around the world. If you claim asylum, you're likely to go into a big backlog, and you are likely to be allowed into the country. And this is, I think we need to talk about it. There are definitely people arriving at the border who need protection. We want an asylum system because that's part of our national values as a country, is to protect people in need. But asylum systems have also become an alternate way for people to come in. And the final thing I would say is changing is that the U.S. has a really tight labor market, right? People come when they think they're going to get a job. This is true even if people are displaced, right? People who are displaced aren't going to make a journey to the U.S. if from afar, if they don't think they're going to get something better on the other end, they will stay somewhere else along the way. People have been coming, but certainly true of people looking to improve their family's livelihood. And we're seeing right now a really tight labor market, and people know if they can make it across the U.S. border, there's a good chance that they get a job. And they're hearing from friends and relatives and friends of friends that this is the moment to come. And look, this is a short-term issue after COVID and the economic rebound, but it's also a long-term issue because, the U.S., like many countries around the world, is an aging society. And without the legal pathways for people to come, we shouldn't be totally surprised that people are finding other ways to get into the country that through the border. We can come back to that in a bit.
But so, I mean, we're still seeing, to put it in overly simplistic terms, very much the push and pull factors there. I wonder if what we're seeing here in the United States is something where we're still relying on some of the mantras of yesteryear without understanding, how things have changed. In particular, I think, that last point that you had about labor markets, aging societies, and we still haven't made that transition to understanding the role of the positive role of migration in our societies. René, let me turn to you. You've been working in this field for decades. You began by working on sort of Mexico-U.S. issues, but you have been working at the global level on migration. As you look at Central America and the flows that are passing through the territory there, how would you say that the current situation reflects global trends in migration?
Thank you again for inviting me to be part of this panel, and great to meet you both. And perhaps in the future, I will be able to say, and I am your friend too, as I hope we will.
Great to meet you, René.
Great to meet you. Thank you for that helpful framing, Andrew, and also Duncan for the final question about how do we understand migration as a positive contributor to the development of an economy, of a society. And I think when you mentioned in some of your introductory comments, some of the global trends which are continuous, people moving to look for better economic opportunities, people moving away from danger is a part of human history. And so I don't know, how we sometimes recategorize some of these movements, use the word migrant is now a negative term. But really it is about, how do people search for better economic or social situations? And yes, to seek new economic opportunities, as you mentioned, and these are still part of global trends. Avoiding conflict or violence. Certainly, again, throughout history, there have been movements of people avoiding, whether it's localized violence or large conflicts between states. And the third, while we do recognize a significant increase in impact of climate change now, certainly migrants or people who have moved previously to follow better growing opportunities or to follow different, or to avoid changes in weather, whether that was annually or longer term. And so there are different kinds of people who move, as we well know, people who move temporarily to help harvest a particular crop, and then perhaps return home, and people who also follow economic trends, whether that is what we, again, we now talk about constrained labor markets, but migrants have always played a role in strengthening economic growth and development in many countries. So I think those are the trends that continue to be relevant. I think we need to frame them and understand how they are constructive and not destructive, and how migration and the flow of labor, the flow of ideas, is actually a source of economic development and social development. So those would be my broad points on your question about what are common trends globally.
Thank you.
Let me jump on with René if I can, Duncan, just because I think he actually hit the nail on the head here, which is, I mean, we're going to focus on the border and people coming through Central America, but in fact, I mean, to his point, I mean, migration has been part of what's made this country function, right? I mean, we've been very lucky through history. Yeah, for decades and centuries. I mean, some migration was forced of slavery, right? But I mean, there was indentured servitude. I mean, it was not always a beautiful process of people, making it. But the fact is, the U.S. has been largely built on people coming together with new ideas, with new, with bringing talents, creating a very plural society. That's actually a really good thing. Now, I think there is, and by the way, it's natural. We're going to see more of it around the world with demographic change. That said, we want to make sure people are coming in legal ways, because if they don't come in legal ways, then it creates pushback because people feel like the world is out of order, right? And the world's out of order in lots of other ways too. So, it tends to create a pushback against migration. But here's the challenge. How do we make it, how do we tamp down the disorder, but actually save the golden goose here at the same time? And that's a really mixed metaphor. But, how do we save the good part of migration, because we need it, but at the same time make sure it's happening in an orderly way so we don't get that pushback that then goes against our national interest?
I mean, a general question to follow up for both of you here on that. Is it that we are seeing the kind of more violent visceral reaction to migration today because we're talking about massive migration, and that has tended to be destabilizing for political systems, for societies? Or is it something about the economic cycle? Or is it just that our politics have changed? René, what do you think?
I'll begin with, to follow up on a little bit of what Andrew said about the US in particular. All of us on this panel, unless we were born to an indigenous community, are results of migration. And so I think that is an important dimension for the US itself to recognize and appreciate and consider as it assesses the trends, the significant increase of migrants in different periods of US history from different places, whether they were European or non-European. And so I think for me, the moment is another one of US history where there is a significant increase, and the social political reaction to that and the racism that comes from that rejection of the new wave of migrants to the United States in particular, which is a country of migrants. And so we have seen this with different categories, different groups, and different ethnic groups from different parts of the world, including from European sources, when the Irish, for example, came in significant numbers. And so I think it is, let's say, a natural social question. Oh, we have a lot of new people coming in. What do they bring? What both, the constructive and the challenging, but then how do we leverage that to grow the country, given the perspective of economic development, social development, innovation that migration does bring to societies?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I think we've set the scene extremely well there. Andrew, I want to get down to some details now. What would you say is the current state of cooperation between the United States, Mexico, and Central American governments on the issue of migration? Over the years, and I've been around long enough to remember the announcements that have come out from new administrations saying, they're going to solve the problem. There's going to be massive investment in Central America. Central American governments have said, well, in exchange, we're going to make sure that we provide those opportunities for migrants so that they either don't leave our territory, or if they come through here, there are opportunities. We've seen innovations in terms of the way that Mexico has become a partner with the United States on migration, and how the López Obrador government over the last 6 years offered to provide opportunities, particularly in southern Mexico, for migration for migrants at the same time as they were deporting hundreds of thousands. Where would you say that we are today? I mean, how would you describe the panorama of cooperation in the region?
I think there's, I mean, a few ways to answer this. I think one thing that was interesting a couple of years ago is you saw 22 countries in Latin America, the Caribbean, the US, and Canada sign a declaration of Los Angeles on migration and protection. It was the first time there was a regional agreement that included the US and Canada on migration. And it basically had four parts, depending how you look at it. I mean, one was on protecting people, creating legal pathways for people to migrate, as well as protection pathways for those that need it. Doing more on investing in those countries that were hosting large displaced populations, because look, as much as people get bent out of shape on migration in the U.S., I mean, Colombia is hosting almost 3 million Venezuelans, Peru 1.5 million, Nicaragua, a tenth of the population in Costa Rica is Nicaraguan born. I mean, René is there. I mean, there's other countries that are, actually much less developed that are really under some strain of recent displaced populations. And then doing more on migration management and border control. And then there's a fourth sort of added part about cooperating on emergencies and specific situations that take place. But it really is sort of that. I mean, those three areas I think make a lot of sense, which is how do we integrate people? How do we help people that are already in the country? Because if you don't put kids in school, people don't have health care, it's a problem, right? Long term. So we want to make sure that immigrants and host societies benefit as much as possible when people arrive. Two, how do you create legal pathways, including protection pathways? But C, also, how do you make sure that there's some control and some order to how this all happens? With the U.S. and Mexico, how this looks like on the ground, though, is much more complicated. I mean, this is great on a piece of paper, right? So with the U.S. and Mexico, the debate used to all be about Mexicans coming to the U.S. and, Americans would say, you need to do more to stop people from coming. Mexican government would say, you need to do more to, give legal status to Mexicans in the U.S., treat them better. Now it's all about, trying to figure out an orderly flow of people coming through Mexico. And so there's a lot of cooperation, certainly on border control. In the case of Mexico, what they've been doing recently is not so much deporting people back, but running them in circles. So sending them back to southern Mexico to start their journey all over again. So there's a lot of that going on. Mexico has also been fairly generous on asylum and protection for people who need it. They have a broad definition of who can get humanitarian protection. And so they've actually taken in people who have decided that they don't want to continue their journey north, or what they really need is protection and they want to stay. And so Mexico has actually invested a lot in and worked a lot with the IOM on this, actually, and with UNHCR on trying to find ways of integrating people who've sought protection in Mexico. And then, there's a lot of attention still from the Mexican government on Mexicans in the U.S. And I think one of the questions out there is, I mean, right now this works fairly well. There's kind of a balance. And I always say, the Mexican government is willing to give the U.S. government a lot on migration, and particularly to do things on migration control, because it isn't politically sensitive in Mexico, right? Whereas it is in the U.S. And so it's sort of an understanding that, if they cooperate on that, the U.S. will mess around less in other things in Mexico, right? But there is a question in my mind of what happens if you get a U.S. administration that actually starts deporting people who've been in the U.S. in large numbers, and those are mostly Mexicans, right? And whether there's still a willingness to cooperate on control. There may well be, but I think that's a scenario. There's a little bit right now of, the Mexican government is happy to work on migration control when it isn't about Mexicans being sent back, right? And it is, there's a certain amount of sort of understanding that Mexicans aren't the problem here and Mexican migrants aren't the problem. It would be interesting in a scenario to see what happens if that is not the case. And there is and here's the doing Harris and Trump, right? I mean, we can get into that later, but I think that's an untested proposition yet of what would cooperation look like. And the same thing is true, again, with Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, a lot of work together on, trying to help the countries develop, but also on some migration control, much more incipient. Panama is the country that really has leaned into migration control, that is starting to send deportation flights to even India, as well as Colombia, Ecuador, and they're looking for a way to send Venezuelans somewhere else. We don't know where yet, with an agreement to take them in. And they sent one flight to India that we know of. So I mean, they really have leaned into migration control with money from the United States. And then you have countries like Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, where the U.S. is deeply involved, but mostly in supporting those countries to host large Venezuelan populations, partially out of the goodness of our heart, but also, frankly, because, U.S. officials can see the writing on the wall. And if Venezuelans who've moved to these countries don't feel at home, they're likely to head north.
Great, thank you. I want to follow up a little bit on the sort of the difficulties of integration, and we'll turn to René on this. René, you made the comment earlier on that each of us is to some degree the product of immigration. But of course, myself, I've been an immigrant my entire life. First of all in Canada, then in Mexico, then now in the United States for 12 years. For me, Canada and the United States obviously were very familiar because of the language issue and because, they're just so familiar to me culturally. Mexico was a little bit different, but of course, essentially, a European-based culture in terms of many of the facets of modern society, and that was relatively easy. But for folks coming in from, other parts of the world, from Africa, from Asia, maybe from the Middle East, landing in the Americas can be quite a challenge in terms of integration, and for the governments trying to integrate that diversity of culture, language, religion, expectations must be a real challenge. I wonder if you could comment on what you've seen through your work with the IOM already in Costa Rica and the experience of the IOM there. And more generally on the role of international organizations in the region. How are they working alongside Central American governments and civil society?
Very well. I'll start with the broad question at the end first in terms of how IOM and other UN agencies work to support governments across the region to assess and develop ways to manage the different types of migration that each country faces. We work very closely, for example, in Costa Rica with the different ministries, particularly, of course, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but also the Directorate of Migration, as well as the Ministry of Labor and the Ministry of Social Work. And so we support them in understanding and managing the border flow. We work with them to support the training that border office officials receive so they understand and are able to identify the different scenarios, whether they are temporary agricultural workers or whether they are part of a flow that is heading north, and the different options that individuals have according to international law to seek asylum or protection or to pursue other possibilities. And I think the collaboration we have here in Costa Rica extends not only to, of course, the government, the support we provide the government, but also to a lot of local organizations, civil society organizations that are committed in different ways to different topics that relate either to migration explicitly or to the challenges faced by migrants, whether that is employability or health or social dynamics that they need to support on. And so we work very closely in coordination with the government to strengthen really the regular pathways, the options that individuals have to formalize their intent, to formalize the way they can contribute constructively, both to the government in Costa Rica, for example, or the society in Costa Rica, as some of them do stay and seek economic opportunities and become regularized citizens so that they are regularized different categories, not from citizenship to temporary status, so they can both contribute to the economy formally and also benefit from the social welfare support, including schools and health services that they do need. So those are some of the ways in which we collaborate with national entities within the Costa Rica example. But and it is replicated in many ways across the countries. Another interesting support is we work with multiple governments across our countries to help them develop collaborative efforts for different ways of coordinating the movement of people across their borders. For example, one very interesting example is the traditional, long established practice of an indigenous community from Panama, the Ngoboble, who regularly came to support the coffee harvest. And that was very irregular, meaning it was just the practice. There was no formality to it. Interestingly enough, during COVID, because all of the countries shut their borders, the private sector demanded a support to be able to harvest the coffee. Otherwise, the economy would significantly suffer. And so we worked with the Ministry of the Directorate of Migration and others to establish a regular pathway for temporary agricultural workers, which was basically just to regularize something that was already happening, but in that process, give these temporary workers both a legal status and a way that they can be formally contributing to the society and the economy, and also benefiting from things like schools for their children. So there are different ways that we work with different pieces of the national government and with different civil society organizations.
Fascinating. Thank you, Renee. And just one of the things that I've observed is that often it comes down to a very local level, doesn't it? I mean, in the case of Mexico, I've seen that Haitian migrants were well received by one town, one city, and then not violently, but they would largely rejected in another place. And it comes down to, to some degree, it's like local perceptions, it's the local economic situation, it's whether or not the local government was able to handle the inflow of migrants at that time. And so, we have to be a lot more nuanced, I think, about this rather than just talking about countries, right? I mean, it does very much come down to what programs exist at the local level. And Andrew, speaking about nuance, I wonder if you could comment a little bit on how the debate in the United States today, how well does it reflect, the changes in the debate, or in the reality rather, the changes in global migration trends. What are politicians and the public missing at this point in time that we should really be sharing with them? You're on mute, Andrew.
There we go. Yes. I think the biggest thing is actually what Renee said earlier, right? I mean, the biggest thing that's missing is the conversation on legal immigration, which is still the predominant way people come into the country, and how we want to structure our legal immigration system to meet the economy of the future. We do have a law that governs migration in the United States, was last updated in 1990. And so we're dealing, an economy 34 years later with the rules that were set, more than 3 decades ago. So, there's no provisions, whatever was set for tech workers in 1990 is what we're still dealing with right now, even though, science and technology has taken off, right? There is nothing for care work. There is no pathway for care work. There is for certain healthcare workers, but they're limited again for doctors and nurses compared to the demand we now have, but there isn't for other forms of care work, which have become much more common in the American economy. And so all of those things, right, are, going on that we just need to have that conversation on legal immigration, but we're obsessed with the border and illegal immigration, right? So that's consumed the conversation. And I think there are a few reasons for it. I mean, I think we shouldn't conflate all of them. I mean, I think there are some people for whom it is a question of losing American identity. And this is a debate that's run through American history, right? I mean, it is, there is a part of the country that simply doesn't want anyone else, or is okay with other people, but is worried about the numbers, or feels like the life in their town is changing in ways that they no longer recognize. That may be good in the long term, but in the short term, it certainly causes stresses and strains. Some of that reaction can be outright racist. Some of it is perhaps discomfort. It's a continuum. But I think that's there, right? I mean, that's certainly there, and it's there in many countries around the world. You add to that there are parts of America where, people without a college degree have probably seen their wages stagnate from everything we've seen economic data haven't necessarily gone down, but their wages have stagnated and gone down compared to others, right, with a college degree in the United States. And so, people are worried about whether that's trade or robots or immigration or, what is that's causing it. And so are likely to be worried about all of the above, right? I mean, there's a lot of research on this. It mostly shows that immigration generally, especially in the United States, is not a contributor to, does not substitute for American workers, complements American workers, makes us more productive. But I don't know if I'm a worker who hasn't seen my paycheck go up and my children are looking at a future that doesn't look any better than me. I would be skeptical of people coming in as well, right? And I'd be skeptical of trade, and I'd be skeptical of many things, regardless of what a bunch of researchers tell me, right? So I think we need to acknowledge that that's a reality. Unless we can fix that, unless people feel like they're moving ahead, that's going to be a permanent feature of the economy. And then I think the chaos. I mean, I think there's a lot of people who aren't worried about identity. They aren't worried about, their job necessarily. But and this is where we really saw the mood shift in the past 2 or 3 years, is this sense that there was no orderly way to make decisions about who was coming in at the border. And I think that actually really moved the needle. And so we've actually seen the numbers go down. Since January, they've been going down, but really since July, they've gone way down. We're back to numbers we haven't seen in 4 years. But it is and they did it without getting rid of the asylum system. They did make it harder to get asylum, however, at the border. But I think there is a question about whether that's, too little, too late, surely in a political cycle in the United States. But, I think we also, I'm going to wade into dangerous waters here and say that I think Democrats tend to underestimate how much immigration, if it isn't well managed, can create a backlash. For all of those reasons, but especially the one around order and chaos, but also Republicans in recent years have leaned in the other side and have tended to think that what Americans want is to shut everything down. And it turns out the polling tells us that isn't true either. Americans do want order, by the way. I mean, that the polling tells us that. I mean, there's a lot of polling now that says Americans are quite in favor of immigration, but they want to know there's an orderly system. When you start asking details about, do you want to deport people who came as children, or do you want to deport someone who's had temporary protection, vast majority say no. I mean, most Americans want immigrants that are already here to stay as well. Republicans are in danger of going the other direction. We saw this in the first Trump administration. Family separation, was a bridge too far for most Americans, right? And I think if we see mass deportations, that'll be a bridge too far for most Americans. Democrats go the other way, right? Of just not getting the fact that if they don't impose some sort of control, they don't figure out measures that create an orderly flow, they lose credibility on this issue. We've seen that happen in this administration.
Thank you, Andrew. We are beginning to get questions coming in. I've already got 3 questions from our audience, but I've got one last question for René, which is really the most difficult question of the day, René. So prepare yourself. This is a highly intractable issue area. We've been talking about migration now, not just for 20 years, but for well over 100 years. At various points, we seem to have breakthroughs, progress, and then we see long periods of stagnation. How do we break out of the current period of stagnation on the issue of migration? And I don't just mean here in the United States, I mean more generally, more globally. Are we waiting for a major change, such as the demographic change that Andrew has mentioned? Or is the best that we can really hope for at this point in time incremental change?
Well, as you said, easy answer. Hard question, easy answer. And I think what I will lean into is really how we're framing. I think, using words like intractable or stemming migration really limits our ability to find solutions or forms of benefiting from the movement of people, the movement of intellectual capacity, the movement of skills. And so I think, perhaps one of the ways that we could address the current perceptions of a dynamic, which we are calling problematic, and it can be problematic in different ways, but it is about the governance of it. And the governance has nothing to do with the people who are trying to come to contribute to the economy and the society. The governance is owned by the governments themselves. And so how a government is able to identify what labor it needs, what gaps it has in labor, what mechanisms it creates to attract the labor that it needs, and whether those are the H-1B visas, the technology skills or other skills, whether it's in agricultural production, really to self-identify what the labor economic needs are, and then create pathways to create those opportunities that the economy itself needs, and turn the dialogue not about stemming, but really facilitating the migration that economies do need. And so that, for me, I think that framing and that the demonizing of people who move is really part of the challenge of the perhaps contributing to the identity sense of loss of identity, or to the racism, or to the misinformation. Andrew was mentioning that the numbers are what the numbers are, and they are not as significant as they had been. And so what does that mean? Why? And how do we create these regular pathways, as as IOM terminology uses, to for people to have the right opportunities, and for the societies to have the right contributions from people who are willing and eager to contribute their intellectual and skills, the intellectual capacity and their skills to the society.
Thank you, René. Okay, I'm going to turn to the questions that we have from our audience. We're at 11:41 local time here, and so this should give us enough time to get through these questions. The first one, I'll direct this one to you, Andrew, but René, please feel free to jump in as well. Can you discuss how organized crime plays a role in migration, both in terms of how crime drives migration, but also how organized crime exploits the migration process, and what can the US do better in this space?
Yeah, so that both organized and disorganized crime play a role in smuggling. Generally speaking, the groups that control smuggling are not the same groups that control the drug trade, right? These are the big cartels. However, that said, there are cases where drug cartels have gotten into migrant smuggling, usually the more lucrative, longer range smuggling, not getting people from Guatemala to the US border, but, getting people longer distances, often higher paid, more of the platinum journeys. And certainly smugglers pay for the right to use territory in different places to large crime organizations that are tied to drug trafficking. So you see this in Colombia and Necoclí, in the area that's sort of the leaping off point for people headed to the Darien Gap, controlled by an organized crime group. And so anyone who's involved in smuggling there is indirectly or directly paying them some percentage of the proceeds. Same thing at the US-Mexico border. Every smuggler who's able to cross someone or take someone to the US border or get across the US border is paying off someone, whatever the organized crime group is that is there. And this may be true other places along the journey as well. Those are just the two we know the most, but it's almost certainly true. That said, smugglers are also their own organized groups. They're networked. They're highly networked. So it's, except for a handful of people who are on these platinum journeys where they go from point A to point B, and they have one smuggler or one smuggling group that's taking care of them. Most migrants are paying, smugglers at different points along the journey. There isn't sort of one person accompanying them the whole way. It can often take weeks or months if they're going on a long journey. That in some ways has given them more agency. In other ways, it's made it more dangerous because they don't know which smugglers they're getting in with. And they're often unprotected on the journey as well, right? And they're often being handed off to other smugglers, or they're simply, on WhatsApp, they're finding a smuggler who they really don't know anything about. So, quite dangerous. Often, a lot of preying on migrants. A lot of smugglers try and squeeze the last dollar out of every, or last peso or last colon out of every migrant that's passing through. And so we'll sometimes kidnap them and demand more money. I mean, there's all sorts of kidnapping operations going on along the journey that's often colluded with government officials. We should assume, that governments are, playing all sides on this, right? I mean, but at a local level, I mean, I remember going to one crossing point that will remain nameless in between two countries. And, right as people were being crossed across a river from one side to the other, there was a police car, just parked there, unknowing that there was anything going on, a few feet away. You can assume that they were, being paid protection money. They were part of this in many ways. Most migrants report along the way having had to pay off authorities as well as people who are stopping them. So this is a large, complex operations, but it moves in multiple networked ways. We have not put the same kind of resources into following. There are more resources now and more attention to this than there was, 5 years ago, particularly from the U.S. government and some of the other governments in the region. But, it's a fraction of what we put into drug trafficking or terrorism, right? And so, tracking the money that people are, how the money moves among these organizations, that's been a, in the end, a low priority. You will start to see more arrests than in the past because they are paying more attention. But it's a fraction compared to other forms of organized crime.
Thank you.
And I will just jump in if you don't mind. I think the absence of regular pathways creates the market for criminal approaches to helping people move. And so I think that the chaos of the self-governance that we see in the US or in other countries contributes to creating the opportunities for the criminal approach to migration. And of course, that puts individuals at risk, at very serious personal risk of being trafficked or abused or otherwise violated during their travel.
I had a conversation. Sorry, go ahead, Andrew.
Oh, no, I was going to say, I'm going to say something else controversial, but I actually think the Biden administration got something right. I got a few things right during this period that hopefully will, be carried on in a new administration, though I think it really depends who wins because it's been vilified a bit from both sides. But, one of the things they did is they knew there were a lot of Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans coming, that it was impossible to return most of them to their countries of origin because those countries wouldn't take them back, with the exception of Haiti, but they didn't want to send Haitians back to Haiti. And so they create a legal pathway, a sponsorship pathway where people can come in for 2 years, parole, humanitarian parole, as long as they have a sponsor who's going to take care of them. Now, there are some better ways. There were some design flaws and things that need to be tightened up, but overall, pretty smart idea to create, for the reasons that René says, a legal pathway that took the money out of the smugglers' hands and allowed people to come legally. They did the same thing on the border, creating something called CBP-1, an app that allows people to get asylum appointments, in theory, asylum appointments at ports of entry if they're willing to wait rather than crossing between ports of entry. And now they've moved it to southern Mexico, which means people don't have to cross Mexico. They can be in southern Mexico, apply. If they get an appointment, the Mexican government will give them a free ride north. These are ways of taking, money out of the hands of smugglers, right? And creating legal pathways. It would be better to do this through congressional action because you get much more solid legal basis for this. But absent that, these are actually creative ideas of like, wait, can we take, there's a big market here. Can we take some part of this out? And it turned out the numbers went way down of Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans. Can we take some more out of this way, and give people another legal pathway? Smugglers don't like that, but there's a reason why they don't like it.
Yeah. I was just going to say that I had a conversation with a migrant in Miami not so long ago, who had Cuban migrant. He had come up through Guyana, of all places, and then walked up.
Yep.
Described going through the Darien Gap as being one of the most terrifying experiences of his life. But he said perhaps the most frightening moment was when he arrived at a town and they had run out of money, and there wasn't a way for their relatives to wire them money in that particular town. And they found that they were then prey for organized crime groups. They said, either you starve or you have to go and commit criminal acts. And he said they were ultimately rescued by the kindness of strangers. It was folks in the local community who gave them what they needed to move on to the next town. But the vulnerability of the migrants along the route is really what a lot of organized crime is preying on. A direct question for you, René, here from our audience. What concerns are Costa Rican citizens raising as a largely stable state in Central America, as it becomes a migration destination or a transmigration place? Do they parallel with the concerns that are being raised here in the United States?
Costa Rica has an amazing history of commitment to human rights and to supporting its neighboring peoples to be welcomed and to be respected upon arrival. And so I think Costa Rica has a very particular and unique approach to human mobility as well. And so that's the starting point. Yes, in fact, also, and these can exist at the same time, there is concern about the numbers of people coming, the numbers of people coming through, how many are coming into the country. Costa Rica also benefits from a lot of migration, as I mentioned, the small example that I mentioned before, but also certainly as a destination migration location. And so for Costa Rica, migration is a very complex and nuanced topic. But in some public discourse, yes, there is a significant amount of disinformation and also concern about what is happening and how are we both treating the migrants from the very positive angle, are we doing enough, to the negative angle, or about what are they taking from us. But the whole range exists. But I think one of the things that I've seen in my short time here is that first part, which is a very a culture and a society committed to human rights that I have not seen necessarily as profound in the US, certainly, or in other countries.
Thank you, René. We've got two more questions before we wrap, and we've got about 8 minutes left, so that's kind of perfect timing. And I guess this question is for both of you. How realistically possible is it to determine true asylum seekers who are protected under international law versus those primarily seeking economic opportunities? If not possible, what implications does that have for having an organized, controlled asylum system in the US? And this is one of the most thorny issues that has come up in recent years. Andrew, do you want to take a first crack at that?
Sure. I mean, it's hard. I mean, no, asylum is not a science. I mean, they try and make it as scientific as possible, but right, when people don't have documents, the alleged persecution is something that happened in a small town somewhere that wasn't reported on the front page of the local paper, right? If anything, maybe there's a social media mention. That's the kind of thing that. There's a lot of subjective decisions being made, right? And people's credibility, is there anyone that could back it up? And yeah, it's hard. I mean, you could certainly resource asylum systems a lot better to make decisions quicker. That's actually the best way that asylum becomes an efficient process that both lets in people with protection needs and also deters those that don't have good cases, right? Because you actually return them quicker. Right. I mean, that's in an ideal world, we would resource this so much better because that's, a quick asylum system. The asylum system stops being a draw. Right. But it also helps people that actually need asylum. But I think there's also a movement towards creating protection mechanisms that start earlier in the journey so that our humanitarian protection system is not based at the border. I mean, if you do a thought experiment, I mean, we're comfortable with what we have, but a thought experiment say, oh yeah, our answer to, to persecution and violence around the world is if someone can make it to our border, we'll consider their case. That's a lousy system to begin with, right? We should have that as a fail-safe. We want asylum to be there as a fail-safe, right? And certainly for people from neighboring countries. But ideally, we want to be processing people's claims far, earlier in their journey, the first country they go to, maybe even before they flee in some cases. And so this administration started these things called safe mobility offices, the processing centers in some countries in the region, including Costa Rica, where they're trying to assess claims ahead of time. I would say the Cuban, Haitian, Nicaraguan, Venezuelan program is kind of a quasi protection. It's protection adjacent, which is to say you don't have to make a protection claim, but it is for people from countries that we know have high protection needs, right? And so it's another way of sort of acknowledging that we need to get to people earlier and give them a legal pathway. The more we do this earlier and the more we make it, maybe we're a little more efficient at the border, including returning people that don't have good claims quickly, then we're likely to see a much fairer system over time, as well as one that doesn't draw people to the border.
And that's a question of investing in the resources at the border, in the number of judges, et cetera, Andrew, or is it about more than?
Well, I think it's both. It's resourcing it better. I would say invest in asylum officers rather than judges. They're usually quite fair, but they also are easier to staff up. And the administration started down that path, and it just didn't continue going there for, I think, resource regions as much as anything else. It is also about the standard, and I would say what they've done, and this is now being litigated, whether it is, legal or not under current law, but there was some debate in Congress earlier this year about doing this, making a legal change that would have definitely given a legal basis, which is if you cross at a port of entry, you're willing to make an appointment, even if you have to wait, you get a lower standard, you get sort of the traditional standard. If you cross between ports of entry, you get a higher standard. There's still some checking to see if you have protection needs, but the presumption is, if you weren't willing to wait, that you're going to have to meet a higher standard. And, I think you're going to see more of this around the world. And a lot of this, I think, is, can you make decisions earlier? Can you actually give people a pathway a lot earlier so that they don't make the journey in the first place? They can find out early on whether they qualify. And if they don't qualify, some people are still going to go, right? But they're more likely to know that they don't have a strong case before they go. And the people who do will get a free ticket to actually come into the United States and get protection, or another country.
René, feel free to jump in on that question, but I've got the last question from our audience from Madeline Blidaru, which is, what would you say are the estimates of irregular migration through Central America for the coming years? Do we see that the numbers are likely to drop off at all? Are they going to grow? Do we have any kind of ballpark figure?
We do have estimates, and both in terms of numbers that we have been tracking across different countries. OAM manages a series of assessments at border posts in terms of helping the governments count the number of people coming through. Last year was a particularly significant increase from previous years, 133% increase from previous years, reaching about 520,000 that were flowing through Costa Rica in particular. And this year, as of last month, we have reached almost 300,000. The number will not likely be as high as last year, but it will be significantly higher than previous years. And so the numbers of people with intention to continue their migration north will be at that number for the foreseeable future. But of course, this depends on particular issues that we discuss, the motivation for moving, whether it's economic or whether it's conflict or violence or climate change, that people will begin to make decisions about where they need to move to have a safer space for themselves and their families.
Great. Thank you. We've talked about a lot of very difficult issues today. I wonder if we can end on a positive note without being facile at all. But Andrew, I'm often reminded of the story that you told me and that you have documented of Hazleton, Pennsylvania, and how attitudes towards migrants changed because of what happened in that particular town. But René, also, I'd love to ask you if you could, if you have a sort of a really positive story that comes out of your experiences. Andrew, why don't you go first? I mean, Hazleton or any other positive story about migration that you'd like to share with our audience.
Yeah, Hazleton is kind of the Springfield, Ohio of yesteryear, right? I mean, Springfield, Pennsylvania, sorry, Hazleton, Pennsylvania was the place where a lot of migrants and children of migrants who were U.S. born actually had arrived in very large numbers because there were factory jobs and there weren't enough Americans that would take them. The city actually had been very successful at attracting these industrial parks with factories and warehouses, and they happened to be on two really good, highway routes. And so, they had done this, and it turns out, this is an aging population. Most of the kids had moved already, and so immigrants start coming in to take the jobs, and that's really jarring, right? And it was jarring for the immigrants. It was jarring for the people who were there, mostly white. It was a tough encounter. It became a center of some real pushback against immigration in the United States. And this is probably 2006 or so. It becomes a flashpoint in the country. Years later, it is now about a half Latino town, not all immigrant because the kids tend to be U.S. born, but, immigrant, children of immigrants. And you're starting to see a city where people have learned to live with each other, right? Where people actually, I wouldn't say it's perfect. I wouldn't say in one generation you necessarily have, you have a complete sense of reconciliation, but there certainly is. The volume has gone down. People spend time together in different ways. There's much more sense of community than there was. And one of the great things you've seen is that, the city downtown and the two business districts have been really revitalized by immigration. And so, it's turned into a lot of entrepreneurship, which shows the positive side of immigration. Now, I know for many longtime residents, it still isn't the same town they grew up in. Now they hear merengue music, a lot of the immigrants are from Dominican Republic. So there's a lot of merengue music now, in Hazleton, Pennsylvania that, used to be a lot more polkas, but, it is Irish jigs and other things, but, that's the way it goes. But it's certainly a better off city today than it once was, with all the growing pains that it took to get there.
Thank you, Andrew. René.
I'll be brief, but a couple of weeks ago, I met a woman with two children who was in the process and completing the process of the assessment and the confirmation of qualifying for resettlement to the U.S. And she described to me the challenges that she faced on her journey, the challenges that she faced in being in Costa Rica temporarily, and really the appreciation that she had and of the possibility of new futures for her children in particular, that they would not have to suffer the challenges that she had suffered in her home country or in her transit country. And I think for us, thinking about these numbers, these categories, this term of migrants, it's really about an individual, a family who is going through a very challenging situation and really seeking a better future for themselves and for their families. And how can we make that a positive experience, both for the person on the move and for the society receiving them?
René, thank you for sharing that story with us. And Andrew, thank you as well. Thank you, both of you, for sharing your expertise today. It's been an excellent conversation. Thank you to our audience for tuning in. And for those of you who are watching it later on our YouTube channel, please look out for a lot more conversations about this and other international issues with the Pacific Council. Great pleasure to have you both with us, gentlemen. And thank you so much for sharing with us.